It's week 3 of 2018, and we're talking about a lot of cloud news coming out this week, things with Amazon AWS as well as Microsoft Azure. And we're also talking about some security and exploits in Apple. That's all coming up on the ITProTV podcast, starting right now. Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Peter Van Rysdam, and I'm joined, as always, by Mr. Don Pizzette. Don, how you doing?
I'm doing swell, ready to address this week in technology news. Lots of interesting stuff this week. No single giant tech event that monopolized the news, but a lot of good stuff.
Well, I think the biggest event taking place in the news right now is it is National Popcorn Day. And here at ITProTV, we focus on the fact that we have binge-worthy learning. And so we've got the popcorn bucket right here. And down in there, as we'll dip in a little bit during the show, we've got some M&Ms down there. That's we have a poll going on our Facebook page right now of your favorite flavor, caramel or chocolate drizzle or just good old-fashioned butter. And this is regular butter with some M&Ms in there, which was my vote.
So if you hear crunching coming from Peter's microphone throughout the episode, that is not his hopes and dreams being crushed, but simply him eating popcorn. And for our listening viewers who don't get video, you can clarify that.
I'll just lean back from the mic there. So, Don, as you mentioned, there's a lot of different stories to get to today. The first one, it actually kind of harkens back to something we talked about last week, which is Don's love of combining his technology, or really just trying to get one less device in his pocket or in his bag as he travels. And so we talked about there was a product called Razor last week that was I think it was out at CES.
The company was Razor. It was their Project Linda.
Project Linda, and there was something they were showing off at CES. It was kind of a concept really of basically a phone that could dock, and that one was in the touchpad, right?
Yeah, you drop the phone in and it became the touchpad.
So it's essentially your mouse on here. And so we found an article, and I thought Don's going to love this, about how Apple can turn the iPhone into an ultra-portable MacBook Air, basically saying not that there's any plans to do so, but just that technology basically exists in the phone now.
So I like this article because I get made fun of around the office. Like I want to be able to combine a tablet and a laptop, where a phone and a tablet are better, all three. Like just make it all one big stinking thing. And I get made fun of it because I've bought numerous products over the years that all claim to do this and none of them do. But one of the writers or editors over at Macworld, which was it Michael Simon, where he actually wrote an article. It's an opinion piece. It's just his opinion, but it's definitive evidence and proof that I'm not the only person on the planet who wants this type of technology. And he's talking about how, man, the iPhone is just as powerful as the MacBook Air, a processor for processor or memory, that if they would just make it where you could connect that phone up and stick a screen on it, that you'd be able to leverage it, or even the iPhone 10 here, that if you could stick a bigger screen on it and a keyboard, you could really make do. And then they go on to talk about the Samsung DeX, which, Peter was making fun of me about before, but I actually own that. It's sitting on my desk at home right now, which in theory gives you that ability to turn your phone into a desktop. Now, I need something portable, so it's not quite perfect. I need it to combine to a laptop form factor. But he even goes on to talk about the Razor Project Linda. So I'm not the only one. And maybe, just maybe, that means one of these days, a company will release a product like this that doesn't suck. And it hasn't happened yet. I bought them all. I know they're all terrible. But one day it'll happen.
So even if the tech specs line up, though, hardware to hardware, you're still going to have to run... You're either going to be running a lighter version of the operating system, or you wouldn't be running High Sierra, for example, on your phone. When you dock, you'd kind of get almost like an iPad experience.
Yeah, I don't think it'd be almost. I think it would be an iPad experience, right? But is that a big deal? It used to be a big deal. Like, oh, I need Microsoft Office, so I've got to have Windows or whatever. Now you're seeing really full-featured apps coming out for mobile. And so people can exist on just an iPad just fine. Take a product like Adobe Photoshop. Adobe Photoshop is very powerful, and if you run it on Mac OS or if you run it on Windows, you get access to a ton of features. Well, they have Photoshop for mobile, and you can install it on iOS, and it's only got like 20% of the features. But what's the old saying? 80% of the people only use 20% of the feature. Like it's good enough for most people and most use case scenarios. And so they can do it. It's more power efficient. It's cheaper and they can get it up going. Most people would never even miss the actual desktop operating system by switching to mobile today. 10 years ago, completely different story. So I think we'll see that. And the idea of having Android or iOS or whatever Google's cooking up right now, this fuchsia thing, having something like that becoming your phone and then just your phone on a bigger screen, it's very, very realistic. It's very possible.
Well, I think we're all convinced. You don't need to keep selling it. But I think we should do a show where we just line up all the devices you've bought over the years and just take a look at, and maybe we could figure out then, here's the features we'd like to take from this one, and this one did a good job doing this, and we can put together that perfect Frankenstein system.
And then be even sadder when it doesn't come into existence.
We're here at CES 2025, and still no. Well, let's shift gears now to the cloud. Our first in a few cloud stories here. Amazon is launching unified AWS auto scaling across cloud apps, and basically it's a way to give a variety of scaling options and lower infrastructure cost while boosting application performance. This is an article from Tech Republic. So, what does that mean for us as people administrating sites on AWS?
All right. In the AWS world, there's a couple of things that make cloud services like this really, really powerful. And the ability to auto scale is one of those things. Like in a private data center, if I have 5 web servers and my load is getting a little too high and I need to go to 6 servers, well, I would have to go and get a purchase order filled out, get it approved by my accounting department to purchase a 6th server. I would have to order it, get it delivered, get it installed, configured, bring it up. It would take a week and a half just to get that 6th server in. So that's how long it would take me to respond to increased load time on a data farm. And that's not realistic in today's world where your company might go viral and you need to increase your load by 100% overnight. Well, in the cloud, you can do that. And if you do it manually, well, it works, right? But if you can do it automatically, that's even better. And with Microsoft Azure, Google Compute Engine, with Amazon's AWS, all of them, they've got some kind of functionality to be able to do that, to just automatically start cloning your web servers and building it out. I'm using web servers as an example. It actually works with a number of things, but it was originally designed for these application type servers. In an AWS, that meant it was a part of EC2, or the Elastic Compute Cloud, where you run your virtual machines, or they call them instances because they have to have a different word for everything. And so that's where it was kind of born and where it existed in the beginning. But over time, when you auto scale, you have this challenge. You've got to configure these rules to test for what's the workload and when do you scale out and so on. And when it was just instances, it was easy to watch those. But now you've got people doing containerized deployments. They're doing Docker deployments. They're doing things that interact directly with a database. And these were things that EC2 wasn't designed to do. It's a separate service, right? But auto scaling worked for it. And so each of these different services were kind of managing in a different way, which made it confusing. And so now Amazon has stepped in and said, all right, auto scaling has grown big enough, grown across enough services that we need to go ahead and make it this single thing that spreads across all the services as opposed to different configurations all over the place. So it makes life a heck of a lot easier. And what I'm hoping it does is I hope that it improves people's knowledge and awareness to know, like, hey, if I'm deploying in the cloud, I should be taking advantage of auto scaling. That if you're not, you're really missing out on one of the biggest benefits of being in a cloud type infrastructure.
Yeah, I used to work at a web development company, and I can speak to the issues you would have before this. We had a client, one in particular, who was featured on Shark Tank. And so we knew ahead of time it's airing on this date. We had to go and call the hosting provider, have them roll up a couple more servers and be ready for that. And, it had its hiccups, but we were able to maintain the load, but then scale back down afterwards to where we needed to be. And then they did a rerun, a couple months later, and we didn't even know that was coming. And so all of a sudden the servers are down again. So, these kinds of things don't happen in this type of environment. So that's something that, this was definitely a pain point for a lot of people that hopefully the next generation will be able to take for granted.
Yeah, and it helps to insulate you if you make a bad guess, right? Mm-hmm. So, hey, we're going to be on Shark Tank next week, and I need to increase my server workload by 100%. I'm going to just double the amount of servers I've got. And maybe that's way more than I actually needed. So now I've wasted money. Or maybe that turns out to not even be enough, right? So a bad estimate can still ruin things. With auto scaling, you can scale to whatever size you need, and it's all instantaneous. I mean, it's a really, really important feature to use. And now you don't even have to estimate. I don't care how much workload comes my way. I can handle it as long as I can pay the bill. I can handle the load that's going to come in. So, that's really cool, and it is nice that this is now kind of standardized across the different services. And they actually list on here. So EC2 is what I mentioned. That's where a lot of this was born. But it's also got EC2 spot fleets, DynamoDB tables, and DynamoDB global secondary indexes, Aurora replicas. All of these we're starting to have auto scaling. You've also got things like CloudFormation and Elastic Beanstalk, where they're tying EC2 instances to other services, and they had auto scaling as well. And that's getting wrapped in there. And this goes hand in hand with a lot of changes that Amazon's been making. For example, the Elastic Load Balancers, ELB, those are now being replaced by ALBs, which are more robust and handle more things than just EC2 instances. So we'll see more of this as time goes on.
Well, and one of the ways that Amazon is able to keep up with this is by continuing to make an investment in additional data centers. And they actually just hit a milestone where they established their 50th cloud zone. They call it in London. So I know we talked about another one recently in the European Union. This one in London, and so just just shows the continued investment and how that's going to continue to ramp up more and more.
Yeah, last week we were talking about it because they added a whole new region, and this time they're adding a zone. And so I think it is important to understand the difference between those. That in the Amazon world, I'm Googling feverishly here to find the map that Amazon puts out on this stuff. But what they do is when they build a data center, if it's a brand new data center, they're building what's called a region, a new location, right? So last week we talked about Paris, Paris, France, and that was a new region for them. But then inside of a region, it gets divided up into zones. And each zone is technically a completely independent data center. So if you take their Virginia region, the U.S. East Virginia region, it actually has 5 zones in it. Well, 5 public zones. There's actually a couple more that are private zones. But there's U.S. East 1A, U.S. East 1B, 1C, 1D, and so on. So those are each completely independent data centers that don't share hardware infrastructure. So they have their own routers, their own internet network connections, their own power connections, all completely separate. So AWS just keeps adding more and more and more of these. And the one that they added in London is, it's their 50th. So 50 data centers. There's not many companies that can build out as many data centers as Amazon has, and to be able to support that type of infrastructure, that is a big challenge. So my Google Kung Fu is just not good enough to find.
Well, I'll ask you. So what is the point of it being part of a region then? If it is autonomous and able to kind of stand up on its own, is all of the data from that zone still funneling back through that region before it hits the internet?
I found it.
Okay.
Sorry.
I'll just ask that question again completely.
So you saw no. So the point is when they build out when they want to build out a data center, they've got to have land, right? And they can rent land, but if you're going to build a giant, do a giant investment, you'd rather own the land, right? So part of this is real estate. If I can buy a big enough tract of land in one place, then I can build more than one data center there as long as I make sure they're getting independent resources. Now, when they build one of these data centers, it'll normally have 5 or maybe even 10 different ISPs that are providing internet service to it. And then they'll have at least 2 power grid connections from 2 independent power grids or power sources. So, I mean, this is a high level of redundancy. Each data center treated separately. And as you look at this map, each circle on this map represents one of their data centers, right? Or one of their regions. And in the region, they have data centers. And so you see like here, there's a number 6. So there's actually 6 different data centers or zones right there in one region.
So they might all be on the same property.
They typically are.
Okay, I see. But it's but they stand alone. So if one were to go down, the next one is able to pick up the load and continue.
In theory, the other one would not. Yep. And whenever you hear about an AWS outage, the outages usually just affect one data center, one zone, right? And so if you have multi-zone replicas, then it's no big deal. You're fine. You survive the outage. But every now and then, an entire region might go down. And that's something a lot of people don't plan for, is they say, all right, well, I'm going to deploy this web server farm, and I'm going to have some in US East 1A and some in US East 1C. Well, if US East 1 goes down, if the whole region goes down, you just lost both of those zones. So you're better off doing a multi-region deployment and stick some in US East 1 and Asia East 1 or Northeast 1. So one of those. And that way you're really spread out that way. And you'd have to have like a full-on Amazon outage, which so far has never happened. It's always been, I think their biggest one actually did affect a region. They've never had one go company-wide.
Well, you've just jinxed AWS there with that.
They're screwed now.
Knock on wood. So another map we want to look at, too, related to Amazon is actually a big deal going on in the States right now, or I guess in North America, where Amazon is down to 20 finalists for their second North American headquarters, which I don't understand. If I understand the word headquarters, I don't know how you can have a second headquarters. You could have a European headquarters and a North American headquarters, but anyway, a second North American headquarters, and they're down to the top 20 cities now, and I think there's only one outside of the States in Toronto. I guess nothing south of the border, but we've got that map up here. So each of those cities kind of making their pitches, I guess, at this point. It's almost like the Olympics, where you're saying, here's the number of people in the workforce that we have, the infrastructure, the most importantly, probably the tax break that we will provide to Amazon if you go ahead and put your data center in our location.
Yeah, there's a few significant things about this. Unlike the Olympics, this is where the Olympics are like, hey, all these cities are bidding to lose a ton of money just to get.
Would you like to make $1 billion investment in infrastructure for a 2-week thing?
Yeah, the Olympics, that's a tough one. Yeah. Not a lot of success stories out of that one. But in this case, it's more like, hey, we're going to come and create 50,000 jobs in your area. So cities are actively bidding on that and just being known for having an Amazon headquarters. Right now, Amazon's headquarters is in Seattle, Washington, which is pretty remote. It's way up here in the Northwest, and all the other dots you'll see are pretty far away from Seattle. So they're trying to get some distance, likely so they can, better service different areas or provide redundancy in the event that Seattle has an earthquake or something of that nature. But the Toronto thing, let's touch on that really quick, because some of you may not know that Toronto is in another country. Oh. So it's in Canada. And if Amazon were to pick Toronto for headquarters too, that's not just a matter of, we're going to, build a building over there. That can be really significant if in the U.S. there's a bit of controversy right now over how Amazon charges sales tax. And if Amazon gets tired of that and doesn't want to put up, that could be leverage where they can say, you know what, we've got a second headquarters over in Toronto. Maybe we'll just close the Seattle headquarters, and now we're a Canadian company. That they could do that. That would give them a lot more leverage when it comes to doing tax argument and debate and so on. So that's pretty significant. I don't know what the likelihood of that is, though, because it's really difficult to move your headquarters to another country. So
that's probably a bargaining chip, leaving that on the map, but definitely an interesting point, especially with the whole story right now with Apple, bringing $35 billion or something like that, or a lot more than that. That's the repatriation tax that they're. I
love that term, repatriate. Like these dollars, they're patriots.
They have to take the oath, and now they're American citizens again, and they're back. Like there's just a stack of bills sitting in a warehouse somewhere.
So apparently there actually is $30 billion just sitting
cash
in a bank account.
Wow.
And it's liquid. Like most companies say, like, we're worth billions of dollars, but it's in stock options and land. Apple, it's literally just money sitting there.
We could write a check right now for
And if they were to bring that over, they would have to pay a huge tax burden on it. So no, we're not going to bring it over. But then they can't spend it. I don't know what the end game is there. So who knows what'll happen?
We're all moving to Toronto. Well, speaking of the cloud and AWS, our next story is about actually Azure and the gains that Microsoft Azure is making on AWS in the public cloud computing market. This is an article from businesschief.com, and they've got the numbers here that in the fourth quarter of 2017, Azure's market share rose from 16% to 20%. And 4%, that's pretty significant, especially just over a short time of one quarter, and definitely would be eating into the 800-pound gorilla in the room, AWS.
Yeah, and I always like to watch this stuff. Amazon has such a big head start on a lot of this, and most of that stems from their origin story, which is, hey, they're an online retailer. They needed this infrastructure that was highly redundant, so why not build it out? And what you're not using, you can rent out to other people to recoup the losses. That's how AWS started. Well, for Microsoft, it's not like that. I mean, they do have a global infrastructure for some of their systems, but it wasn't at the volume level of Amazon's. Because if Microsoft's website went down, that didn't really affect whether Windows 95 would boot up, or so they didn't have to have that same infrastructure. So Microsoft specifically set out to build an AWS competitor, and I've been surprised at how well they've done with it. Azure's actually a really good product. Other vendors are doing the same thing. Google with their Google Compute Engine, IBM with theirs, whose name I can never remember because they changed it. It was like Blue Link, and then they changed it to something else. I can't
And
remember.
this mentions Intel as well as a potential player. Are they in the market that you're aware of? I haven't heard of that one.
Maybe
I
indirectly.
mean, I've heard of Intel.
Yeah, well, yeah.
They're the
Now,
ones with the chips leaking all the data, right?
well, Intel has been pushing their what's their operating system? They started making their own Linux, a Clear Linux. Is that what it's called? Where it's a specific distribution of Linux that is optimized to run in virtualized environments on Intel processors. And
Clear Linux.
Clear Linux. There we go. So the Linux benchmarking site Phoronix, they did some studies on it, and like pretty much every application they tested ran better under Clear Linux. But don't take that as me saying, oh, format your laptop, put Clear Linux on there. It's designed to run in a virtual machine, and it's designed to run in a cloud environment. And so with a cloud payload, I'm talking about a server payload, it will get you better performance. So a lot of people are starting to look to that to use as the underlying layer for their Docker containers and other products. So I know Intel does that. As far as actually competing in the data center space, I'm not aware of that. So who knows? Maybe if any of you guys out there are familiar with that, make sure to shout out to us on social media and say, I can't believe you haven't heard of... we can make up a name, right? Intel Cloud Inside.
Intel Spectre. That's taken.
Yeah.
We'll think of something.
They're looking to melt down the cloud industry with their new cloud offering.
One chip at a time. Well, some more cloud news here, and related back to Azure as well. This is an article from Zdnet talking about how to run Linux on Microsoft's Azure cloud. But we just want to talk a little bit more about that because that's not necessarily news there. But I know we've talked recently about the investment that Microsoft's making in open source technology, and this article stating that 40% of all instances on Azure are running on Linux. So just shows that this is not a hey, we're going to throw you a bone and put 5% of our machines in this environment, but 40%, almost half now, are running on Linux. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, this is one that continues to amaze me because I know when Microsoft originally said they were going to offer Linux virtual machines in Azure Linux, or in just Azure, I kind of assumed that they were going to end up doing something like SUSE Linux, right? Because they had that deal with Novell, and it's all kind of tied together. But they didn't just stop there, because they have CentOS support, they have Red Hat support, Ubuntu. So you have the flexibility to do whichever operating system is you want. You throw it in there and you get it up and going, and they found that there's been a huge uptake in Linux, and Microsoft has been shifting that way. One of my predictions that we talked about a little bit at the New Year's episode was that I really wouldn't be surprised if by the end of this year there's some kind of Microsoft Linux that comes out, some kind of distribution that they bake themselves, because they've released SQL Server for Linux now. They've released the Visual Code code editor, which runs on Linux, Mac OS, and Windows. And now the news article that I kind of tacked on to our show just maybe a few minutes before the show started was that on the Microsoft PowerShell team blog, they've announced PowerShell Core 6.0, which is a new version of PowerShell. It is generally available, so it's available right now. You can go download it from Microsoft's site. In the past, if you were a Windows user, you'd say, oh, yeah, I can go to Microsoft's site and download it. If you were a Mac user or a Linux user, you'd say, PowerShell is lame. But now you can say, oh, I'll go and download it, because PowerShell 6.0 is the first one to actually support Mac OS and Linux. So they've actually got where you can run your PowerShell on these other operating systems. You can connect up and manage Microsoft servers with it now, and in time, you'll be able to connect and manage other things. specifically, we're thinking the Azure Linux deployments, right? So that you can use the PowerShell and all of its associated commandlets to manage your Windows and your PowerShell system. Your Windows and your Linux systems. Now, I don't know when that's going to happen. So for right now, it just means that if you're a system administrator, you could actually run a Mac or run Linux, and you could launch a PowerShell session to manage your Windows servers without actually having to fire up a VM to get to it or use remote desktop or whatever. So another sign that Microsoft is moving into support more and more Linux. And this goes back to that prediction that I have, which is I really think we're going to see things like Active Directory and SQL Server and Microsoft Exchange become containerized, where they can run on top of Linux. And then if you have your PowerShell running on top of Linux, you can actually operate in that environment, and Windows Server becomes fairly obsolete, or just not so much obsolete as unnecessary. And I think that's probably the direction we're going in.
So is there anything else interesting about PowerShell 6.0, or is it the big change that it just supports these other systems now?
To me, that's the big change. There are a few other little things that were added in, but nothing too super crazy. You'll see where they did experimental support for ARM32 and ARM64. So more and more companies are realizing that while Intel is kind of the de facto standard for processors, that there probably will be a time where Intel isn't the de facto standard. So they're starting to branch out a little more to handle ARM processors. The other thing was the breadth of the operating system support. So they're doing Red Hat, CentOS, Debian, Ubuntu, OpenSUSE, Fedora, macOS, right? I mean, macOS 10.12 and higher. So a number of different systems all being kind of wrapped in
And
there.
if you scroll down right there, down right about there, it says check out what's new in PowerShell 6.0. So it's kind of got a full list there. And that's a different link than I clicked on. But yeah, it looks like it moved from the .NET Framework to .NET Core, and then the support for Mac and Linux is the next thing listed there. Some stuff about logging.
Those are the big selling features, right? But I mean, there's a bunch of other stuff. It's got semantic versioning. Woohoo!
Oh, finally.
So yeah, not as exciting. But SSH-based PowerShell remoting, PowerShell remoting or PSM. PSR, if I can get my acronym right. That one's been around for a little while, and it used some of the Windows TLS encryption, but now it can do SSH-based. There's Docker support, which has been in beta for a while, so that's not so much new, but I guess it's generally available now, so you can actually manage your Docker deployment. Little known fact that if you run Linux as your operating system and you want to run Docker Enterprise costs money. It's not free. Right? So Docker itself is kind of open source, but then to run Docker Enterprise, you got to pay for those features. But if you have a Windows server, Microsoft's actually negotiated out with them where you get Docker Enterprise for free on a Windows server. So not many people run Docker on a Windows server. I think that's why they did that. But you can do it.
How dare they make us pay for their intellectual property?
It's crazy.
So speaking of some of the big players out there and their own Linux distributions, well, I guess this isn't their own, but Google is changing now from Ubuntu to Debian as their in-house Linux distro. And so that's not the kind of thing that really affects you and me as individuals, but just interesting to see. I know we've had some episodes in the past about how to choose a Linux distro and what's important for you. So any insight into why they might have made a move like this?
So up until now, Google's been pretty tight-lipped on the operating system they run inside of their company. That if you are a Googler, if you go to work for Google and you get a company-issued machine, many employees are issued a Chromebook. And so if you're given a Chromebook, you're running Chrome OS, that's a given. But for their desktop users, which are almost all of the developers, they run Linux. But it's their own spin of Linux. And most people refer to it as Goobuntu, that it was the Google version of Ubuntu. They would take Ubuntu Linux and they would modify it pretty significantly. So it was not the same kernel. It had a lot of inline kernel patches and stuff that were applied that made it different than regular Ubuntu. So many people would say, like, boy, I want to run their version. I bet their version runs awesome, which for the record, it really doesn't, because it's got a lot of older libraries. It's not necessarily the cutting edge in some areas. In some areas it is, some areas it isn't, because they're trying to make it reflect the various platforms they're developing for. So it's not really something we'd want to run outside of Google, but they do it themselves. Now, they announced, it wasn't like a big announcement, we're doing this. It was one of their people was at a tech roundtable and made the comment that they were going to be switching to Debian. And I think it's important to add a little bit of context to this so we know what it really means, because Ubuntu is based on Debian already, right? So Google is just saying, hey, let's cut out the middleman and just go straight to Debian. More importantly, Ubuntu, it's not just based on stable Debian, it's based on the testing branch of Debian, kind of like the beta branch, which is one of the reasons why I don't like Ubuntu. But you know, so they basically build that one off of this testing branch to be a little more cutting edge, to be a little closer to what's the latest software that's released. Well, Ubuntu is based off of Debian testing. So Google just said, look, we're going to switch and base off of Debian testing, and that's that. Now, Peter, you mentioned this doesn't really affect us. It could if you run Debian as your operating system, or even if you run Ubuntu, because Google, they run testing on all of this stuff. And when they find flaws or bugs or fixes, they submit it upstream. They send it up to, you know, Debian headquarters, and the team at Debian can look at it and integrate that into their code. So they are making Debian better. And as it gets better, Ubuntu gets better because it's based off of it, right? So in a way, Google is sending hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of dollars worth of developer time into fixing and stabilizing those operating systems. And that really does help that culture. And while it's not directly through Ubuntu anymore, now it's just upstream to Debian, they both still benefit. So at the end of the day, this doesn't necessarily impact your average end user as much as it would impact an employee at Google. But it is neat to hear, and it gives a little bit of insight into how these open source projects can survive the way they do without taking funding. Like, how has Debian stayed operational without taking, you know, charging money for their OS all these years? And it's because of companies like Google that are just dumping tons of resources into it. It makes it a symbiotic relationship.
Sounds good. Well, stick with Google, but shift gears a little bit now to security. Another great article that we found. This is on Zdnet. Google awards a researcher over $110,000 for an Android exploit chain. So, you know, this payment of bounties. I wonder if it's something we're going to see even more and more of. You know, we talk a lot about. You know, with Spectre and things like that. Or I can't remember the one we talked about recently, where it was basically researchers that found these things and share it up the chain. I mean, that's going to be big business here as people maybe take off the black hat and put on a white hat to be an ethical hacker and share that information along and make some money.
You know, a lot of this comes from the iOS jailbreaking days, right? So in the early days of the iPhone, there were a couple of people like, was it GeoHot and people like that would create these jailbreaks for iOS so that you could run unauthorized applications on it, right? Where you break out of the walled garden that Apple created. Well, they would create these hacks and they would just release them to the public so everybody could do it. And they didn't really make any money on it. And that was it. They just did it because it was fun. Well, now we're finding where nation states and criminal organizations will pay really good money if you can share with them an exploit to be able to compromise people's systems. And so now these hobbyists and researchers and gray hats, black hats, white hats, whatever, when they find an exploit, the temptation to just sell it on the black market is really high because they can make a lot of money. So some of the bigger players in the market have started creating bug bounties, and it's just to incentivize people like, hey, if you find an exploit, instead of selling it on the black market, if you tell us about it, we'll pay a reward. Now, most companies don't have the infrastructure to be able to pay that. Sometimes an attacker will find an exploit, and it might work on 100 different companies' web server because they're all the same version, and they'll go and try and claim the bounty on all 100 companies. You know, that kind of thing. That doesn't work out so well. But for Google, they obviously want to keep their data safe. And in Android, there have been some known flaws. And this one, it's not actually one exploit. It was a combination of vulnerabilities that, when strung together, allowed you to run unsigned code. And that, or actually, this one was worse, right? Because it was remote code it was remote code execution.
And it's on the Pixel 2. Are you still rocking your Pixel 2, or you moved on, right?
Yeah, I moved on. Yeah, the Pixel 2 didn't last long with me. So if you actually liked that thing and kept it, then
you deserve what's coming to you, right?
Yeah. Well, the nice thing here is that Google's already patched it, right? The Pixel 2 gets monthly updates, and they were able to patch this, but they paid this team, because it was a team. I think they credited it to one person, but it was actually a team. Wang Gong was the person from Alpha Team. So the team, Kihu 360 Technology,
sure, sounds domestic,
rolls right off the tongue, got this money, and part of it was from the Android team. I think it was 100 and
Yeah, it says down here it was $105,000 for his report with an additional bonus of $7,500 through the Chrome Rewards program.
yeah. So this was an exploit or a combination of vulnerabilities that applied not just to Android but to the Chrome web browser. Google actually has multiple bug bounty programs, and a lot of companies do to try and incentivize people to report these bugs. So
Yeah, and it says here that the scheme has awarded researchers over $1.5 million to date, with the top research team earning $300,000 for 118 vulnerability reports. So
yeah.
just shows that we're talking about big money here, and you're going to see. I don't know if that's what these are already, but you're going to see businesses that have entire departments just looking for bugs now and cashing in for those rewards because. When you think about what Google would pay if there was a real, or if this vulnerability was found by someone with malicious intent, it's going to be a lot more than $300,000 or $1.5 million.
You look at Target, right? So Target got compromised, all their credit card data got stolen, like really, really bad. How much did they have to pay out to basically work the PR angle?
Yeah, I was going to say PR, brand impact, and maybe lost customers. I don't know.
Also, I will say with them, most people didn't seem to care. Like, we'll still shop at Target, and I didn't see commercials apologizing or we're going to protect your data better. They did like a blog post and it all went away.
Yeah, sorry.
Well, maybe they spent a ton of money to quash media reports. Right? This could have been millions of dollars in bribes. We don't know.
That's what I assume. Well, and you take companies like our next story here, Forever 21, which is one of Don and I's favorite stores. We go to the mall often over lunch and browse at Forever 21. But they had a breach over the last year. It was affecting people apparently for months in 2017 at the point of sale system was breached. And what this article is talking about is not just that the breach existed, because these things are happening all the time, but it's basically talking about how AI, or artificial intelligence, one of Don's favorite buzzwords as well, would have caught this breach by just detecting the irregularities in the system. And what do you think about that, Don?
It's true that, and they say artificial intelligence, and really, this is an example of machine learning versus artificial. See, when I think of artificial intelligence, I think of a computer that can think and do on its own, right? But that's not really what's happening here.
Kit from Knight Rider.
Yeah,
is essentially what I'm thinking.
If it doesn't have turbo boost, it's not artificial intelligence.
And it doesn't have a voice that I don't want to. Know what.
And a little red light that goes back and forth. I mean, it's a very simple list of criteria. And this is the Turing test, right? That's what it says. Red light. But what we normally have is machine learning. This is an example of words just being thrown around. What the article is saying is accurate, though, if you throw away the word part, that basically with Forever 21, they had a consistent type of network traffic, right? When you have a point of sale system, you have cash registers, and you scan an item, and it does a database lookup to find out what that item costs, right? Maybe the database is local. Usually it isn't. Usually it's on some centralized network. And then when the purchase occurs, it's got to reach out and talk to the credit card vendor, right, to determine if the funds are available or the card is active. And then once that's done, it processes the transaction, writes it to a receipt database, and you're done. 3 different types of communications to 3 different destinations. If you had a security infrastructure in place, like an intrusion prevention system, an IPS, and it learned that these are the 3 types of communications these cash registers make, then the moment they tried to make a communication that didn't match, they said, wait a minute, we don't normally talk to a server in Lithuania or wherever, or we don't normally use SSH, we normally use this other protocol. The moment it saw abnormal traffic, it could have blocked it. It could have stopped it, and that would have prevented a breach like this. That technology has been around for over a decade, right? You just need to install the appliance in line in between your network and the outside, or even directly after the POS systems, and it inspects the traffic and watches it. It learns what's normal, and then you flip it into enforcement mode, and after that, it blocks everything else. Now, it's easy to look at attacks like these in hindsight and say, oh, that's how we could have fixed it, right? For all we know, Forever 21 didn't even build their network. They said, hey, we're going to buy this point of sale system, and the point of sale system or POS company, which is an appropriate name.
Yeah, I was going to say, POS there, huh?
They may have come out and installed the network and set all of that up. Like they may have been completely managed. So Forever 21 might have been trusting that on this contracted organization. We don't know those details yet, but and sometimes we never find out. Sometimes it does turn out to be their fault, but it could go either way on this one. But yeah, the technology is out there. I see stuff like this, and the first thing I thought when I heard, because this attack was several months ago, when I first saw this one, I was like, man, I wonder if this is going to be like the Ashley Madison breach. Do you remember that one?
No. No, I don't.
And everybody was like, "Oh, I can't wait to see who's in that database, right? Who's got a user account in that one?" And there were several high-profile people that turned up in it. I was like, "Ooh, who's going to turn up in the Forever 21 database?"
Everyone at middle school, I'm sure, was looking. Are you in the? Yeah. Who's Stacy shops there?
Oh goodness,
very exciting stuff. But yeah, that might have solved it. But I'm sure the POS company has changed their name now, and even if we hear about it, it's a company that doesn't exist anymore. So next up in the great news of things that make you feel good, Ghost Team Adware can steal Facebook credentials. And what's interesting about this story is not that they're able to steal credentials and serve up surreptitiously pushed ads. That's a fun word to say. But the way that this was uncovered was 53 apps in the Google Play Store that were basically giving this access. I know we've talked recently about Amazon's ecosystem for apps, how it's a little different than iOS, where you've got choices. You've got Google Play, you've got Amazon, and you've got a bunch of different ones out there. But interesting to see that this actually came from the big one, from the Google Play Store, and that these apps with this malicious code were able to make their way in the system. So how does something like that make its way past those protections there to stop that?
It is interesting because like Apple, they actually have a manual review process. The app goes up and a human being runs it through a series of tests to inspect to see if it phones home or sends inappropriate data or doesn't match up with their terms of service. Google doesn't do that. Google has an automated scanner that runs across it. And automated scanners, well, they usually just detect attacks that are well known. So in this case, it was a new type of attack, a new way of demonstrating this, and Google scanners just didn't pick it up. Now, once Google becomes aware of it, they can take action. They can remove it from the Play Store, and they can even send out a bullet to all of the Android phones to uninstall it if it's already installed. So they can find that. This one was a little frustrating because the way that it infected the system, it was kind of hard to get out. So I'm not entirely sure that Google can remote uninstall this one. But it's also frustrating that it made it into the official Play Store. Now, where you usually see stuff like this spread, when you read articles online about so-and-so mobile adware or spyware, it's almost always affecting Asian markets. Because in Asian markets, piracy is fairly rampant, but also because you have a lot of state-filtered internet, like China with the Great Firewall of China, where they might not have access to the normal Google Play Store, so they install some third-party Play Store that has untrusted apps, and you get infected. In this case, it was coming from the Google Play Store. But did you see the chart? Let me bring the chart up here, where they're showing the countries most affected by Ghost Team, by this collection of apps, and it's all Asian countries: India, Indonesia, Brazil. Oh, Brazil's not in Asia. Sorry,
I was waiting for you to get to that one in Australia.
Basic geography.
Yeah, it's
Vietnam, Australia. Which Australia's not Asia. But it's most
close.
of their internet connectivity does run through Asia. It'll pass through Malaysia. And then you've got the Philippines. So it is mostly Asian markets and Brazil somehow. So I don't know why that is. I'm kind of curious. When you explain it as, oh, they're using third-party networks or third-party Play Android stores, whatever, because of state-filtered internet, that makes sense to me. But when you take that argument out, like this is just in the regular Google Play Store, did something stop it from getting in the US Play Store, or did they just not submit it hoping it wouldn't get noticed?
Or I wonder if these are apps that are in certain languages maybe, so the people that are downloading them are going to be the people in those markets. That's interesting, though. We can see if we can find out some more about that in the coming weeks as more and more comes out about that, hopefully. And just by the way, every time you're talking, I want to reach over and grab from the popcorn, but if you go to Don's shot here, we can see now that the popcorn is still in the shot. So if I just don't want to be this guy in the middle of while you're talking. And
now you got to remember that most of our subscribers are audio only.
Oh,
and
yeah.
See, you just gave yourself away.
That's
Nobody would have
true.
known.
Yeah, they're
until they heard the crunching.
The chewing might be a big tip-off there. So next up, we want to talk about a new macOS malware that hijacks DNS settings and takes screenshots. So they can see everything I'm doing now? Is that what's going on? This one sounds scary to me. Is this one of those where the headline sounds scary, but in reality it's affecting 1% of people?
Yeah, so this one is it sort of is scary if you get it. Your system gets infected, it begins monitoring what you do and taking screenshots. Now, keyloggers are a really big problem because they can record your passwords as you type them. Screenshots aren't normally a problem because most applications, when you type a password, it's obscured. So, maybe you bring up your banking details, but they didn't get your password, and maybe your account number is displayed on the screen. So that does kind of limit the exposure there by doing a screen capture like that. Typically, how you'll see these used, and we haven't seen how this one gets used yet, is that they do screen captures and wait for you to access inappropriate materials and then use it for blackmail. Like they'll do targeted blackmail on these things. This one is very early on, so we're not really sure. It's not a very sophisticated attack. It's basically a Trojan horse that you install some application not from the Apple App Store, but honestly, that's a barren wasteland. You know how people say the Windows App Store is basically empty compared to the iOS App Store? Well, the macOS App Store is practically empty compared to the iOS App Store. So most people are installing applications on macOS directly from third-party providers. So you install an application, and it's got malware in it. And Apple will release a fix for this if they haven't already that'll prevent that from occurring. But if you install the app, it installs a false root certificate. So you begin to trust these signed certificates or signed applications that are then able to be installed and actually affect the system and modify it in a way that can't easily be recovered from. Once that happens, then it has access to everything. So right now it is collecting a bunch of information. This article actually came from hackread.com. And if you go to their website and read the article, down towards the bottom, they give a few ways to tell if you're already infected. The main thing that the infection does is that it will change your DNS servers. Most people don't manually set a DNS server. They use DHCP. And you can spot the malware DNS servers because they're 82.163.142.137 and 82.163.143.135. It's the same for every infected machine. So if you spot those, that's a good indicator that you are infected and that your system has been compromised. And they wrote somewhere on here, there's a download link, they wrote a little checker you can use to run to see if you've got it. But honestly, you don't really need that. If you just see those DNS servers, those are not normal DNS servers, and it's a pretty good indicator your system has been compromised.
Well, I just checked, and I'm good here. So
you still running Sierra?
Yes, I am. I just will not make that jump, and maybe sometime soon. And I keep getting the what I love too about the Sierra upgrade. It keeps saying, "Hey, Sierra exists. You should upgrade." And my options on the box are install now or learn more. There's no thank you. So I actually have to open the App Store and then just close the App Store and deal with that every couple of days now. But it's more. It's easier for me to do that than it is to deal with all the viruses and things that are affecting High Sierra.
I like to look at it as you're thinking differently.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
There's you could upgrade to High Sierra, but everybody's doing that.
Yeah. I'm thinking I don't want my information compromised, so I'm not there yet. And in what is turning out to maybe be a not so great week for Apple, another one here, and this is something you said you've heard before, so it's not necessarily new, but a text bomb is the latest Apple bug. So basically where someone can text you a link, and it sounds like without even going to that link, it's able to crash certain elements of your phone where either it crashes messages or even shuts down the phone. So something that is not a mission critical thing, but it's definitely an annoyance.
Yeah, and we talked briefly about it before the show, and I didn't mean that I had seen this specific
that
bug.
code,
There was actually a similar one years ago where you could send somebody a text message, and if they unlocked their phone and read the text message, it would turn their phone off. And so you could quickly, basically do a denial of service in a way. You're turning their phone off, and they would just turn it back on. It's not the end of the world. But when they turn it back on, what would happen? Text message was still there, right? Yeah. And so a lot of times people would have to restore from an iTunes backup or whatever to get around that. Well, this one's a little bit similar, except it's actually more effective because if you have where your text messages are displayed on your lock screen, when you receive the text message, the phone actually parses it to display it on the lock screen, and it locks the phone up. Now, the reports are coming back a little mixed, and I don't have an iPhone to test this, but some
And
people
I will
are.
not let you use my iPhone to test this.
We'll use your FOSCam.
Yeah.
So some people are reporting that it locks their phone up and then they have to reboot. Other people are saying that it actually makes their phone reboot automatically. So I'm not sure what condition leads to what. And this came from the BBC. They didn't have too much more on the detail here, but they're basically saying, look, don't be alarmed. This is not. It's not like they get your data. It just annoys you. But let's say you're having an emergency and you go to call 911, or for our British listeners, 999. They go to dial that number, and all of a sudden your phone reboots because somebody was pulling a prank on you, right? That could cause you an issue there. But at the end of the day, it's just not the end of the world. But this will get patched pretty quick. I don't view this as like a security exploit as much as it is just a bug, something that needs to be fixed. It's not like, oh, you can bypass the pin screen by leaving it blank, which is unfortunately what Apple's been doing lately. So, this is definitely lower on the scale of flaws, but Apple's been under a lot of scrutiny lately, so this one's gotten a lot of press.
Is it 999 in Germany as well?
I don't know. I just know UK.
That would just be no.
Yeah, I went to France a few years ago,
yeah.
and I just said, "Hey, I'm not going to have an emergency because I don't know what to dial."
There you go. Yeah, that works. Yeah, well, this also says it happens on computers, on Mac computers. It will cause the Safari browser to crash when you go to this link as well. So it sounds like something that maybe people just start sending around to their enemies, or hey, go and try this, see if it works. Like you can charge your iPhone by putting it in the microwave.
Yeah. Well,
that's just something that went around for a while too, and a lot of people went ahead and tried that. And
it was an April Fool's joke, and when you post something on the internet, it stays around a lot more than just one day. So
my idea was a pregnancy test on the iPhone that you can figure out how that works, but probably a little less of an issue. Speaking of patches and releases and fixes, we've talked a lot about Spectre and Meltdown and other things in the past. And last week, I think we talked about how those patches, in a lot of cases, were causing more issues as well. Specifically on Windows 10, was this the ARM? No, this is the AMD devices in Windows 10, where basically the patch was causing some systems to crash and lock up and be completely unresponsive. So Windows now has released 3 new releases for that to make to address those unbootable state issues and make it so things finally work. So hopefully we're seeing the last of those patches now coming out. There sounds like there were some issues with Linux. There were some issues. Apple's went pretty smooth. I guess they had some issues.
They did
at first, but they were able to fix those relatively quickly. So now we can kind of switch our focus back to the root cause and see how we can get to a system where we're able to leverage all of the power of our machines now.
I've been shocked at the internet sentiment. Like if you go on to Reddit or Hacker News or sites like that, there's a lot of people talking saying, boy, who sells servers with AMD processors? We're leaving Intel. Well, at the server level, Intel performance is so much greater than AMD that it would be a shame if people start moving their data centers over to AMD. Hopefully Intel gets everything squared away. We don't have these kind of problems going forward. But I do want to caution all the listeners out there, don't make a knee-jerk reaction. Just because there was a flaw in an Intel processor doesn't mean the other processors are better, right? Like ARM processors are still slower. They don't have the same performance level with a straight up like an Intel i7 or even a Xeon, which would really knock the socks off it. There is still a place for that. We just have to make sure we take the right security precautions.
Well, that goes back in my mind to people saying, "Oh, I'm going to switch to Mac because they don't get viruses." Well, it's just for a long period of time, people didn't write viruses for Macs because you had such a high percentage of people on Windows. So same kind of thing. I mean, these are people looking for these exploits. So if everyone switched to AMD tomorrow, they're going to spend their time trying to crack into those chips as opposed to the Intel chips. So you're right, knee-jerk reactions. that could be expensive and time consuming, especially in the server field.
Although it'd be good for AMD.
Yeah, I'm sure they're the ones pushing that campaign. So, last and final thing we wanted to cover today is just a language change, kind of to CompTIA. Their cybersecurity analyst course was called CSA Plus, and now it's CYSA Plus. And why was this?
Why? I see what you did there.
Yeah. Again, we need that rim shot here. We've talked about that. Yeah, that's.
We we actually joked around about this quite a bit, like because. The first time I was told, in my mind, I'm like, CYA plus what? You have to have a certification for that? I understand that one. But no, they are doing it as CYSA. And, it's the Cyber Security Analyst Plus. If you're not familiar with the certification, it's actually a really good certification that CompTIA just released. It's only been out, less than a year. And it's designed to basically cover people who are doing auditing and pen testing. How do you evaluate a network to make sure it's secure? What tools do you need to know, and what processes do you need to follow to test that? Super relevant in the current landscape. In the IT world right now, there's just so many compromises. This is really good stuff. So they called it CSA, which was that Cyber Security Analyst. Problem was there was already a certification out there called CSA, and I've forgotten. I feel like we looked it up at one point and found it, but so they decided they needed to rebrand to not double up with the other vendor. So now it's CY, and the Y is lowercase because it's just CY for Cyber Security Analyst Plus. So CYSA Plus. It's the exact same certification, the exact same objectives, the exact same exam number. You're just sticking a little Y in there. So anytime you hear us say CYSA Plus, we're talking about the same thing as CSA Plus. Definitely important. If you bought books to study for the exam under the old name, that's fine. None of that has changed. The exam and all of it is less than a year old. So it's definitely not going to change for a solid 2 years probably. So looking at it from that perspective, you'll probably be able to get a really good deal on books that are branded under the old name. Yeah,
I wonder if they're stripped from the shelves, though, if there was copyright information.
They are, but the used market will dry up as people look for the new name. Yeah, good point, though, Peter, is that CompTIA did a release to all of their partners saying you need to pull back any material with the old name and put it out with the new name. So you'll see that change occurring over the next few months. And if this is the first you've heard of CSA Plus, be sure to check out CYSA Plus. It's one of the more exciting certifications to come out of CompTIA in a while. Everybody's heard of A Plus, Net Plus, Security Plus, but they have a handful of others like Project Plus and Cloud Plus that are really good but haven't gained a ton of traction. CYSA Plus more than likely will.
How is this different than Security Plus?
So there's actually 3 certifications that are security related, and they're designed to go in elevating levels of difficulty. So Security Plus is kind of like foundational security that every security practitioner should know, but really every system admin and network admin should know as well. So Security Plus applies to a lot of people. CYSA Plus applies to people who are actually testing security and designing security. So actually trying it. It's a very much more hands-on, not so much fundamentals and theories, but actually getting in there and doing something. And then you've got Casp, the advanced security practitioner. And that's for people that are actually in IT security management. And so it deals a little more with regulatory compliance and auditing and blue teaming than it does on the red teaming side. So each one kind of caters to a different market, but they get increasingly more difficult. Security Plus, I'm going to say it's the easy one. It's actually still kind of hard. Mm-hmm. CYSA Plus gets a little harder. Casp is actually significantly difficult.
Cool. So yeah, if you've got a Security Plus certification, maybe go out and try the CYSA Plus now and see what happens there. So I think that's going to do it for us this time. A good week of news, and like you said at the top, nothing catastrophic, nothing that's going to keep us hiding under the desk here. A few vulnerabilities and things to look out for, but all in all, a good week and a lot of cool cloud news and things that leave you a little excited for 2018 coming up with I'm anxious to see now too if Microsoft does come out with its own Linux distro and see how that all plays out. But like I said, that's going to do it for us this week. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done so already, or go ahead and review it if you've done that. We'd love to get those reviews and share it with your friends so you can let everyone know about this great information that we're putting out. And definitely enjoy your popcorn on National Popcorn Day here. And until next time, we'll see you guys.